So our panelists today, we have Kavita Pure, who's a writer and broadcaster, Pat Hart, long-time broadcaster on Bristol's BCFM, but also now has taken up a position with the BBC at West Midlands as well. And Vada Ibrahim, who's an advocate at the Tallow community and also a community facilitator at MShed. Welcome, everybody. By way of introducing yourselves, can I just kick off by asking you all what your experience of oral histories is and how you came into contact with them? I'm going to start with Pat because he's at the top of my screen.
I'm always the one that gets picked on first. Thanks, Mary, and hello, everyone. I guess my experience of sound archives as we know them has been with Bristol Museum, funnily enough, and Bristol Archives, with the projects that we've done with BCFM Radio and Marcus Smith and Katie. And I found them really, really fascinating. And I also find fascinating the description when we talk about archives, old recordings maybe that my dad did on the old reel to reel. It may not be archived officially, but it's archived within the family. And just hearing voices and accents, whether they're international accents or regional accents, are really, really warming for me. So I've grown up around sound. I've always been interested in sound, but actual archives, really my first experience and excitement was with Bristol Museums and the archive system there.
Kavita, you're next on my screen.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you for hosting the event. Well, I'm a journalist. I'm not an oral historian, although I suppose I've become one. And I always had access to the BBC archives. But back in 2013, I was looking into doing a Radio 4 series. And I wanted to do the story of the South Asians who came over in the post-war years. And I looked into our archives and I found nothing there on radio or on television. And I thought that was quite baffling, really, because we do document, we have documented the Windrush generation, but for that generation that came over in those kind of post-partition years from the Indian subcontinent, those stories weren't there in a very meaningful way. And so I set about trying to collect those stories of people who are actually quite elderly now, and their story of arrival back in the 1950s. And those series did really well. And so I'm now on the 5th series of something called £3 in My Pocket on Radio 4. But it was while making those series that people kept talking about this thing, partition. And that's how I then started to collect oral histories on partition of people who live among us, British people, British South Asians, and British people who lived through that time and hadn't really talked about it for around 70 years. And so I came across it by accident because I saw that there was a gap, not in the archives, the historical archives, but a gap in our general knowledge in our country about our own history. And so for me, it was important to record those stories before it was too late.
Thank you. Vada, what's brought you to oral histories?
Well, I think I was actually recording oral histories before I even knew I was recording oral histories. Much of my life was around speaking into a cassette player to people I hadn't met yet. And my mum would be like, that's your grandfather, that's your auntie, she lives here, this person lives there. And so I'd never met these people, but it was a relationship that we built through only the voices. And so later on in life, when I did meet them, it was then that I was able to put a face to their voice. And so even I think that really made me a very descriptive type of person. Whenever someone's telling me a story, I'm always thinking, but where was this person standing? What were you feeling? It's just kind of like, I really enjoy just hearing something before I even need to kind of like see it. I just really need to kind of imagine it. And so that's when I saw the position for the MShed Museum. And so this was collecting stories from migrant communities. So the project is called Migration, Heritage and Belonging. and it spans across like 3 different museums, one in Norfolk, the Royal Maritime Museum in Greenwich as well. And so they've got the community facilitators in all 3 going into the community and then gathering those stories. And doing that was just like the most natural thing. The only thing I had to change was don't interrupt the people, just let them describe something to you, and then just kind of take your time and just kind of like make sure that it's what they want to speak about. But otherwise, I've been feeling like I was doing this like my whole life really, and now I'm just getting paid to do it. Yeah.
Vada, I think you've just touched on the next question that I'm going to ask. I mean, my background is I have recorded some oral histories myself, but I've also worked as a sound recordist for a very long time. So I've been witness to a lot of interviews, and I've also been witness to that moment when the tape recorder's turned off, and then the person tells you all the really good stuff that you really wanted to record and you've just missed. What do you guys think makes a good oral history, and how do you make sure that you get the good bits? And I'm going to mix it up, and I'm going to start with Kavita.
Well, I think whether it's oral history or journalism, what you want to elicit is the story, and it's the story that the interviewee wants to tell you. And so for me, it was very important that they knew me beforehand, and that I would always have a chat to them about what I was going to talk about, and that I did it in a setting that they would feel really comfortable. So I would always go to their homes because they are comfortable, and they might have someone in the room with them that they know. So maybe husband, wife, daughter, granddaughter. And for something like partition, which is incredibly traumatic, and the subject hasn't talked about for 70 years, you don't just go in straight away on that trauma. You get a sense of the person. So I would always ask tell me about your childhood, and was it happy, and what were your games that you played, and tell me about your parents, and where did you grow up, and what was it like? Because you're trying to put people at their ease. And then once you've got there, you've established a relationship with them. And also, by the way, these things are really important. You don't just want to hear the kind of really difficult bits. This is a very important part of collecting the testimony. And then you ask very gently about difficult things. And not all interviews are difficult. Often the ones that I would do seem to be quite difficult. And I suppose what's very interesting is I am a journalist, but my instinct when I'm interviewing my interviewees is not a journalist, that if it's too much for them, I will say, shall we stop? Shall we take a pause? And if there's something they don't want to say, I will always say, then we don't need to, you don't need to say that if it's too much. And I think I always felt quite a lot of duty of care to them. And I was very respectful of the story that they wanted to tell me. And so I suppose against my instinct as a journalist, where you just want to elicit the story, I wanted to do right by them. But I think that the most important thing, and especially if you're asking about people's memories from a long way back, is it's a really odd thing. And I would say, listen, sit in the pauses, be at ease in the pauses, because it's not always something that people say. Sometimes they don't say anything, and you just have to sit with them. And it might be long, but they're remembering, and you just have to sit it out. And things are coming back to them. And not everybody agrees with me, but sometimes I will go back and interview people, because when you speak to people, it triggers memories that they haven't really quite grasped at the time, but they might want to talk to you later. It's a very long answer, and I suppose it's quite specific to the kinds of interviews that I do. And maybe, I don't know, maybe Pat and Warder's interviews are not as traumatic as a lot of the interviews that I have done.
Pat, yeah, I'm going to come to you next, because I think that there is a big difference being a broadcaster and being in a radio studio, perhaps, when you're doing your other work, and there's the fear of a silence in a radio studio, isn't there? But with oral histories, that's part of the story, perhaps.
Yeah, thanks, Kavita, for answering the entire question. I've got nothing to say now. I'm only messing. The first thing I need to say is I've just looked down on the list and somebody's put, how can you put Bedmo for Bedminster? It's always been Bemi. Just go back in the archives. So Marcus, stop it. Don't make Bedminster Bedmo, please. Otherwise you'll be growing a beard soon. Back to the question. Kavita, it's funny you say that because there's often a mistrust of journalists. So when you do ask questions, people don't want to be particularly open. But I guess for me, the difference is if you're in someone's home, you know, keep the mic running, let people know, hey, we're just recording now, but don't worry. We don't have to use everything. And as you said, Kavita, I think trust, it's so important, knowing people. If I'm going to go meet people from global majority backgrounds, often just the way that I look or the way that we all look, funnily enough, on today's panel, will help us. And understanding in so many different cultures, for example, you know, in Somali culture, you know, it's not written history so much for everybody all the time. It's oral history, it's a spoken word. And respecting that and being close to people. And you're absolutely right. Pauses. Oh my gosh. Even for live radio, I find it really important. And I found talking to people who've gone through everything from domestic abuse to have had an a positive HIV diagnosis in a situation, and then they're talking about it. They're talking about a bereavement. They're talking about all of these things. To be able to get them to talk in a studio situation is really, really difficult for me. But I think the way you do that is to make sure that there aren't lots of people around. So when you've got camera crew, you know, you've got sound recorders and all these different people, but actually try and make it a one-to-one, and be respectful. Really listen to what people are saying and not necessarily load up question 2 that you've got written down, but actually be organic about the conversation and show somebody that. And this isn't a journalistic thing, because I do care, and I know everyone on this panel does care. We care about the people that we're interviewing, and we care about our integrity. And as Kavita said, if somebody doesn't want something mentioned, it's not about, oh, I've got a great scoop here. It's about really respecting that and letting people know, do you know what? We won't mention it. And more often than not, that person then thinks again and say, do you know what? I know I broke down, but it's actually okay. Or we'll go back and we'll talk to them 2 days later. So I think trust and making people feel comfortable and respecting and having integrity is the best way. And obviously making sure your microphone is on. Yeah.
Vada, you're the one who hasn't labelled themselves as a journalist on this panel. I'd be really interested to know what you think.
I think because I'm coming from a point of view of like the community side, so a lot of my connections were through people who worked in different types of organizations, and the people that I'd met through in meetings and just really just kind of unofficial in a way. But I mean, it's all being said really. It's just to really make somebody feel really comfortable with you. And there are times when I've had a recording in my office or in their home. And there was one week where I had 2 different people that I was interviewing. And for one, the first one, I'd gone to the lady's home and I had a bottle of water with me. And then next one, I was in another lady's home, but I didn't have any water with me. And so it's like, the first lady that I took my bottle of water to, she wanted me to have a cup of tea with her. And I was just like, no, it's okay, I've got more water, I'm all right, let's just do this. And then it didn't say anything. We kind of just talked a little bit and then we went into the recording. The following week, when I didn't have anything to drink and I was really thirsty, she made me a cup of tea. We sat there, we had this whole kind of like really in-depth conversation, and it really set a tone of like, okay, so we've done with the tea. Okay, so let's go and sit down now. Let's go and do this and record. So it kind of broke up the officialness of it as well. And it brought us together that we had already done something together. So that always makes a difference, I think. Like if you even have just meeting them beforehand as well. I think someone said that as well, but just setting that very trusting environment, whether it's in their home, your home, but just also making them a guest, and you allowing yourself to feel like a guest as well in their spaces. I think is a really big part of recording stories. Yeah.
I think you all touched a little bit on approaching sensitive topics with people. I mean, do you sometimes have to distance yourselves from those topics where they might be sensitive? They might be sensitive to the interviewee, but they might also be quite sensitive to yourself.
Wow.
Would like that one, Pat?
It's probably because I'm not by history, I'm not a trained journalist in that sense, but I find it difficult to distance myself to human stories. And you know, I'm not going to lie, there are times when I've done interviews and I felt tearful, or people have told me stories that really resonate with me. And when that happens, I think people can sense it, but I really get engrossed in that interview, and I really have, I wouldn't say it in a patronizing way, but I really have sympathy, sometimes empathy for the person that I'm talking to, and I care about them. And I think people can sense if you're genuine. And I think, I mean, listening, Kavita, I could go on for 2 hours about some of the stuff you've made. It's amazing. And listening to some of your partition stuff, the people that spoke to you must have trusted you, and they must have known that there was a connection to the story with you as well, which is how you managed to get so much amazing content. So I think it's really important when people are talking about those subjects, and there are some horrible things that happen in history and that happen now. I don't think you can necessarily distance yourself from it. And if you do, I don't know, how human are you? But then that's just me. People may disagree.
I think I'm also thinking about if someone says something to you that either shocks you or makes you angry because you disagree with it, or you have an emotion around it, is then still being able to continue with that interview in a way that's honest and respectful to that person as well. Mm-hmm. Is that something that's ever happened to any of you, or is it a difficulty?
I mean, I've interviewed, sorry, I'll shut me up, Mary, if you want. But for example, I've interviewed people from the far right in terms of and their views. And I found those things, though I don't agree, I really want to understand. I think one of the biggest problems we have, and oral history helps with that, is that we just listen to things that we think are you know, in our bubble, what we agree with. We don't want to hear anyone else's story. Well, why do you feel like that? What led you to be like that? So yeah, sometimes you've got to distance yourself from the hate, but if someone agrees to be interviewed from, let's say, a far right organization that hates people who look like me, then of course I'm going to have my back up a little bit, but I want the conversation. And the only way I can have a conversation is by asking questions and listening. So even then I wouldn't separate myself, because I want to understand what makes somebody be like that, you know, and vice versa. They may ask me questions, don't know.
I mean, I would say that this is where me as a journalist does kick in, and that I want to be dispassionate. And if I am interviewing someone who holds views unpalatable to mine or different from mine, that's irrelevant. And my duty is to understand why they hold those views, and what is the context that they hold those views. And I don't think that we should get emotionally involved in that, because if we're talking about the historical archive, we can't just not include the bits or the people that that have hold views that we don't like. And so I think it's imperative that we record those interviews, and we exercise exactly the same judgment and ask the same questions and have the same rigor as we do with all interviewees. And so I don't have a problem with that. I mean, I interviewed people who said that they murdered people, because that's, and they can explain it away, but it's not for me to judge that right or wrong. Or people who said, I passed lots of dead bodies and people were asking for help, but I walked on by. I wasn't there, but I want to record their stories. And so I think that we as oral historians or journalists have to be impartial, actually, and just ask the same kinds of questions with the same kind of interrogation to everybody.
Yeah, every answer you touch on the next thing I want to ask, actually. Well, just what are your views on why is oral history an important way of contributing to the historical record? Vada, do you want to go for that first?
Well, I mean, oral histories it's that gap really that hasn't been filled. It fills a gap where there's no political discourse. There's nothing but the human element of the story. There's no way of manipulating that. You know, the way we record history is through items and objects, but also that personal story needs to be there. These items and objects, their meanings can always be manipulated. And a lot of the times there's policies, there's activities by governments, NGOs that don't ever get caught or recorded of the implications that it has on the people, the survivors. And oral histories makes that a reality. There's countless occasions where people have just told other people, shared these stories, and there's no way of ever bringing any justice to those people without those voices, because otherwise it just gets covered up and the next government comes in or the next story just swipes it away. And it's through the stories, I think, that allow the listeners to kind of keep the memories of those people alive. Images as well, if it was in a video format, I feel like the video format is just, it brings up biases. There's other things, people don't always speak as freely as they do when they know that they won't be identified. They know that their image isn't being used in any other way. So it's just that one voice and the contents, that's the only focus. So I think that's why it's just probably one of the best ways of kind of like holding a story in history, I think, yeah.
It's an interesting point. It's also been quite accessible to a lot of people for a long time, hasn't it? I mean, cheap methods of you recording yourself have been around a long time, so there's a lot of material. Pat, do you want to get in on that one?
Yeah, I think, Vada, I really agree with what you're saying in terms of that anonymity of just a sound recording and not video. And actually the fact that it's not written, you know, we could go on for ages about the books, the historical books, well, so-called historical books, in terms of informing us at school, but actually oral histories are from those many people from working class backgrounds in this country, certainly oral histories in different parts of the world, for those that sometimes never got the opportunity to write, and if they did write, nothing was ever documented in terms of what they said. They may have had a diary. So this is getting rather, I think you used the word, real people or authentic. This is getting a real authentic perspective on things that we've read about, but actually they're written about in a way that many of us don't even recognize, because it's by scholars who are often, middle to upper class, who had their own view on life, when actually those stories being told orally gave us a realistic perspective. What was it really like for us and our families, living in different parts of the country or parts of the world? So important, and so important that we keep them, that we transcribe whatever's on certain formats into digital format, and we keep doing it as well. So what we're doing today is history for in 50 years time, what we're talking about today, and recognizing that too.
You also get a sorry, Kavita, go ahead.
Well, no, I mean, what I would say to that question is it's the lived experience of human history. And how can you talk about human history without talking about the lived experience of human history? How could we talk about the Holocaust, for example, without speaking to the very people who lived through it? And I think that the purpose of oral history and the importance of collecting it is to add another dimension to history. Otherwise, you hear about history from the perspective of high politics, from the civil servants, from the politicians, which is important, but it's one particular viewpoint, as Pat says. I mean, when I was looking in the British Library at the India archive about partition, there were no testimonies of people who had lived through it. How on earth is that possible when it's the largest migration in history outside war and famine that has ever happened? And so if you don't hear those stories of people who live through a human experience, then you're not getting the full picture of history. And that's why we haven't had the full picture of history, whether it's women or whether it's people of color or for whatever reason, because they haven't been asked. But we can ask now for those people who are alive, and I think we should, because it just means we understand the experience. Now, maybe I'm getting onto another question here. I'm not saying that oral history is perfect. You know, it has its own flaws, but it's just one dimension of looking at a historical event.
You get a massive amount as well, don't you, from just listening to the way that someone tells you something. It's very different to reading something in a book, when you hear the emotion in someone's voice, the accent that they have, the words that they use, the way they use dialect and language. That tells you way more than some other methods of looking back at the past.
Honestly, it really does. And the thing that I remember about my interviewees is often it's not just the words they said, it's the way they said them. It's the pauses. I remember one of my interviewees was remembering something really horrific, and I lost him completely. He was looking out of the window. He was saying the words to something that happened to him 70 years ago that he had never said out loud. His son was sitting in the room, had never heard this story, and he was gone. He was in the room physically, but he was gone, because I knew he was remembering that moment. And it was really difficult for him. And so nobody said anything. It felt a moment of great sanctity, actually. Nobody said anything until he came back to us. And I actually did say, do you want me to pause? And he said, no, I want to tell you my story. And so you're absolutely right. And actually, that's why it's important for me. I've always recorded, probably like Vada and Pat, I record my interviews, so people can hear them. And I've also got written kind of transcripts of them, but the written transcript doesn't capture that. It doesn't capture those moments. And maybe that's very emotional, and kind of historians would say, well, you know, what about the facts? But you know, those people are the facts. They are the statistics of those huge events. That man was one of the 12 million people that made the journey from Delhi to Pakistan. And so we should listen to that story, and we should listen to the way he spoke about it. And sometimes history should account for those kind of emotional feelings as well.
Yeah, I find it quite hard to separate that idea that people's emotions about something that happened to them, that's also a historical fact. I kind of feel. But Vada, how do you feel about those issues?
I feel like that's the biggest draw for me, because the way that people are talking, it's them seeing themselves in history, and so they're talking almost like they're recording a witness statement that say for or against history, and so they're describing what they've seen, what happened, who it was, and they're coming from a point where either they've chosen to speak to you because they've finally got closure, or they haven't got closure, or that they feel like it just has to be heard because they need to acknowledge, they need to just leave it here in the world. That's the thing. And then the people aren't usually people who want to be able to, they don't like the glamorous fanfare of just kind of getting dressed up and getting interviewed in a big studio, all of this stuff. It's people that want to remain quiet in their homes and just talk about what happened, because sometimes you hear stories and you think to yourself, my goodness, that sounds like a book, that sounds like a movie. Like, how did that ever happen to somebody? And it just makes me think, like, we think celebrities and big famous names have these things, but it's really the people that have got these stories and they feel like it's just bursting to come out of them. And so it's just really amazing. I think I just that's what I feel like is just giving the people that I speak to that release and the ability to just take it from them, basically, and record it in history. And a lot of the times that's what I say to them to convince them. I say to them, this is going to go in history, this can get listened to many years from now, and someone's going to be able to relate to it. Someone's maybe even something can be done about something that you've spoken about. If it can't be done now, it will be done in the future as well. And so, yeah, a lot of times people are happy to hear that it's getting saved in history and it's not forgotten. Their pain and then what they've suffered hasn't been left.
So it's so interesting you say that, Vada, because I found that even in families, nobody asks. And so you might be the first person to have asked them about this experience and this huge moment that they lived through. And, my interviews would say, why do you want to interview me? I'm not, a really important politician. And then they would tell you this literally unbelievable story that you could make into a movie. And I had the same experience when I would say to them, thank you, you're going to be on, Radio 4. They were like, yeah, okay, whatever. And when I said, but your testimony will be kept in the British Library forever. And, historians can read your story. I think that was the first time that they realized, so my story is important. It's not just this thing that happened to me, and that it's worthy of being told. And some, often they would cry because they had never occurred to them before. And that's the thing is, I think people think they need to be important to have their story told and heard and listened to, but they really don't.
It's amazing the way that you guys describe. One of the things I realized from some of the questions coming up as well is that some people get scared about, well, if you're talking about conflict, for example, there's more than one side. And it reminds me, when I was a bit younger, one of my brothers was in the army and we were in Cyprus. And if you went over to Turkish Cyprus or Greek Cyprus, on either side of this no man's land were signs and stories and pictures. And it was strange. The stories and pictures were identical, except that one side said, this is what the Greeks did to the Turkish. And on the other side, this is what the Turks did to the Greeks. And I'm honestly not joking. The stories could have been the same story with just some of the words changed. And my take on that is actually, it's really important that both sets of people were able to tell their stories. So not to be scared about, well, this person told this story about this is how it happened. Because we know that if all of us now are watching a particular event, we would recall it in a different way. And that would be based upon our biases, our affinities, who we think, what tribe we think we belong to in that sense. So we shouldn't be scared of that. But when we retell the stories as podcasters or as broadcasters, we have a real responsibility, to make sure for authenticity and integrity and balance as well. And what I loved about listening to, sorry, Kavita, going back to yours, Partition Voices was that in the space of 2 minutes, we heard from all of the sides. It wasn't about an agenda. It wasn't about, Kavita, where your family were from or what you thought about it. It was really going and saying, let's take an open look at this and speak to everybody. And when you're presenting audio, it's really important to get both sides, because if you don't get all of the different angles, it kind of cheapens one of the angles, because it just means it's from one point of view. And we're living in a world where I think we have too much of just one point of view. We need to have balance.
Actually, I think you raise a really good point, and it's something I should have said about doing interviews, which is when you talk about balance, is being aware of our own biases as we enter the room. And I think you have to be conscious of them, and then you have to negate them. Because, you know, oral history is, of course, it's full of bias, and you know, there's a selection in the questions that you're asking. But I think that, you know, we're trying to try and distill information in its purest form. And so we have to be very aware of our own prejudices and put them to one side. I mean, Walter and Pat, I'm sure that's something you think about quite a lot.
Yeah, no, definitely. And but sometimes, you see, as journalists, many of us, and I'll say us, but many of us, we don't always recognize those biases. We think that we haven't got them. You know, I've been on an online course, so I've got no unconscious bias. But actually, when we go into those situations, they do kick in. And you're absolutely right, Kavita. We need to negate those sometimes, or just take a step back and go, hang on, why am I asking this question? You know, let me try and do this differently. So we're constantly, like a computer would constantly reevaluate, recalculate. I think it's important that we do that, because we do end up getting more authentic stories that way too.
Yeah.
Vada, did you want to get in?
Yeah, I was going to definitely, I agree with all those points. It's really difficult to kind of not as well direct the conversation to what you want to hear as well, and just to kind of like make sure that you're not trying to get one version, like making them focus on something that maybe they don't see as very big. So you're not sure, are you digging? Are you pushing? You don't know. Are you just asking? So you have to kind of really be careful and just think, because you don't want to take the story that they think it's quite general standard, but then you to kind of drain it into something, make it into something else. And it's something that I feel like I have to always kind of be careful of as well, because these are people's memories and the way they remember it. And if I was then to compile something that sounded a lot more negative than they remembered it as well, because maybe I thought it was really quite wow, maybe, you know, like a really big deal, but maybe they didn't really see it like that. Maybe something else that they wanted to focus on, I didn't think it was worthy. So it's like you have to just kind of like make sure that you just have those conversations with them and say, and just check, is this how it was? Do you feel like it was like this? And things like that. So yeah,
breaking it down, Vada, is really important, because sometimes when people are recalling something, so they may be recording an experience or suffering or something physically, a house was burnt down, and within that retelling of the story, they'll say, yeah, well, it was the government. So, and actually breaking it down and saying, well, actually, this part is what happened to me, and then this part is how I saw it. Who was responsible? You know, we believed at the time, but actually we've read or we've heard now that wasn't the case. So sometimes as journalists and people that are archiving, we need to not to change, but to help them break down and separate the experience from the blame. Record it all, but actually do that in a different way, so that if we need to separate those things, it helps us balance it out with the same stories and different sets of blame for a different side.
But I also think you can, because we're talking about memories, and certainly when I was doing my interviews, the memories were 70 years on, and it's important to say that, because people do forget, or they remember having read things. It's very, you know, you have to put it in the context that these are memories a long time after the event, even though they can remember events, big events that happened quite vividly. And you can, as the interviewer, interrogate. So sometimes people would say something, but I would say, but did you see that with your own eyes? Right. And then people would say, no, my cousin told me, and it happened in her village. So not your village, no, in their village. Okay. So, but what did you see with your own eyes? So if it's hearsay, That's not first person testimony. First person testimony is what you have seen, what you have witnessed. And sometimes people do get confused, and you're absolutely right, Pat. You have to break that apart. And sometimes people will contradict themselves, and you have to take them back. Did you say, oh yeah? And then they'll kind of, and I found that often when I would like look over the testimony, I wouldn't cross-check it, but there were things that I could verify quite easily and some I couldn't. So when I wrote my book, I would say, these are the things I can verify and these are the things I can't, but this is their memory. And I think, people do talk about the dangers of not the dangers, but there are downsides to oral history. And I would always say, of course there are, especially as these memories are older, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't record these memories. You just have to have the caveat that these memories are being told, many years on.
Yeah.
I'm just going to break in there because we've got a couple of questions in the chat. And just if anyone else has got any questions, now would be a good time to pop them in the Q&A because we're getting to the last sort of 15 minutes of our session. Got a question from Lee, who has asked, so do you feel that audio recordings bring out more authentic responses than video recordings? Maybe people will talk in more depth for audio and not everyone's comfortable with visibility. But would someone like to answer that?
Well, I do radio and I do telly, and in my experience, I think Pat mentioned this earlier. I think the fewer people in the room, the better. Better if it's just you. And the ideal is just an iPhone to record because people don't even notice it and it's just sitting on the coffee table. The more stuff you have, the less comfortable it is, even if you're in your own home and you're very conscious that it's being recorded. The more stuff you have, you're very conscious. The less stuff you have, it feels like a conversation. And so I think audio is always better. Having said that, I did also video quite a few of my partition interviewees, but the camera was really small and quite unobtrusive. But I think that for really sensitive things, you always get more out of audio recordings. You just do, because there is an anonymity to it. Yeah. And you put a camera in someone's face and it feels like a stranger standing in your room, really.
Yeah, I agree. I agree, Kavita. And I think somehow, and I don't know how, because there is an anonymity to it, but I think with audio recordings, you can't really hide. And I think as listeners to podcasts, we put our earphones on, we can hear the intonations in people's voices. We can hear, I remember listening to the partition voices, and there was a lady and she'd never ever been back. And I think it was Kavita or somebody asked her and said, why not? And she just said, her accent reminded me so much of my mum. And she just said, because, I still think that I could get killed. And you could tell in her voice, maybe she was an older lady, maybe in her 80s or 90s. But that was her genuine impression that, 70 years later, that's what she felt. And I think if I were to, it takes away the imagination. I'm listening to audio. And a bit like reading a book, I'm coming up with my own ideas, but I feel that I can trust that voice so much more than if I had to look at it on a screen. There's so many other things for me to see, the background, what she wearing, what she looked like, etc., etc. Just give me the voice, strip it down, and I think that's really authentic.
Vada, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly nothing really much to add, but just it allows for a lot more freedom. You can, even though you can stop and start with a camera, the person can be sitting however they want. They can do whatever they want with their hands. A lot of the times, if you're talking about something that's quite intense, the people would change position a lot. They'd touch their face. They do all of these things that they wouldn't feel like they can do if there was a camera there. So
yeah, that's a good point.
It's just really just calm. They don't have to worry about anything other than just the sound of the voice, which they can't control, which would give them away no matter how they felt, no matter if they try to conceal it or try to kind of go on just talking about it, it's just their voice would just change. So that's, yeah.
Kavita, I think this one is off the back of something that you said earlier. Catherine's asked, what are the issues of libel in the context of recordings that discuss murder or attacks on people?
Libel, well, I suppose they've said it themselves, haven't they? So
I suppose the ones that you were talking about is people had talked about things they had done. So yes, they'd said it about themselves. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, they said it about themselves, and actually, that particular person, I think maybe, yeah, he said he used, or maybe a knife. He gave somebody a knife. He didn't actually kill somebody. He gave someone his sword to then kill somebody. He was a boy, and he said, I was just a boy and I did what I was told. But I mean, everything I do, my lawyers will look over, but I mean, yeah, it was, I think in that particular case, there wouldn't have been a particular issue because he wasn't the murderer. But I think it's really interesting that you say that, because, you know, we know in partition, for example, that people did kill, people did rape, and obviously it's very difficult to find those people. And so you're going to hear victim stories rather than perpetrator stories. And so people are quite sensible, and or they will say, if they say, I did it because I had to do it, or I was told to do it, or, you know, I couldn't have intervened. I think people can justify things after the event, and so they are quite careful about what they say. I think very few people would say, I killed somebody and that person, you know, now I did it in this country. And I've read a lot of oral history around my subjects, and I think that's quite unusual.
Yeah, and I think
having said that, there are people who, you know, fathers would say, I beheaded my child to save her dishonor, for example, which is murder. That happened in India, but, you know, would that be considered murder? It wasn't considered murder then. So many people were doing it. But it's a good question. Now I think about it, but I think people very rarely admit to it.
But there's two things, I guess, is if you're libeling somebody else, and as a reporter, if somebody's saying, listen, I gave this to Kavita Pure, and they're mentioning your name, then that's something as producers of audio that we were going to publish, that we would take out. So people admitting things that they have done is really different to saying, listen, I know there was this bloke called Tom Jones and he did this, and I remember watching him do that, because actually you're libeling somebody then in that sense, especially, you know, if you're publishing the recording in that sense. But in another sense, people want to tell their own stories, and it's our responsibility how we archive them, and how we, I suppose, editing them, that's another subject, but how we push them forward. Do we give a complete recording over or not? I don't know. But I don't know, what do you think, Vada?
Yeah, I feel like there's definitely a lot of things to kind of worry about of what they share with you. You don't know how much of it is, what can really be done about it at that time as well. And I think the only thing that you can do is make sure that they won't come to any immediate harm now, today, by putting it out there. So there's been times where a woman had wanted to talk, let's say, about an ex-husband or something, and she really wanted to talk about it, and I really wanted to hear it. But then I said, are you sure you want to do this in this much depth, in this much detail? And she's new to the UK, so she doesn't really have a whole understanding of how things work here. So I had to make sure that she understood what this meant.
Yeah.
Without just collecting the story and just thinking, yeah, this makes a great piece, I'd love to put this in my piece, you know? And so I had to make sure that she knew that how this would play out if this was, you know, the scenario and stuff. So I feel that that's what I could do, is just make sure that from this point that they are happy when we leave, that they won't feel like, why did he let me record that? This what happened to me, that, you know, those kind of things don't follow on after we meet. So that's the only thing I really think I control.
I think that the morals is a whole other hour talk, isn't it? The things that could happen and your responsibilities towards people. I want to ask this question because I think it's a great question. Finn has asked, are there particular oral histories that you think British museums and archives should prioritise collecting right now? Who wants that one first?
Wow. I'll go first just because I jump in the silences. I'm a radio person. Do you know what? Everyone's going to have their own view, and probably everyone will say, yeah, well, I want to tell our story, or white working class people, or refugees, asylum seekers, or the LGBT plus community, Windrush. I actually think that if we're talking about now, I'd say no. Apart from, let's just prioritize talking to those that don't normally have a voice. So whoever you are, if you're living in communities and you have something to say, I think it's important that we do archive that, and we try and make sure that we balance and get a cross section. Britain in 2021 is diverse, and it's not diverse because everyone's jumped over here. It's diverse because of our colonial history, and it's rich and it's amazing. And so I would say, let's just prioritize those that are hard to reach, those that don't have a voice. And that does include our white working class communities. It does include our global majority communities, our women who traditionally, when they wrote, it was never published. When they spoke, it was never heard. So yeah, those that don't already have a voice, I would say we should prioritize.
Vada?
Definitely would agree with what Pat said as well. Another angle that I feel like doesn't really get covered as much as well is retired police force, retired people in power that were putting regimes that were pushing policies, basically. Those people that were told this is what needs to happen, ex-soldiers, military, people like that. They do the job, they retire, that's it. But if you were to collect, let's say, all of the world's policemen and kind of have that conversation with them 10 years after an incident and something that they've been made to do, they've been paid, this is how they've kind of lived their life. Like, what were the repercussions on them emotionally, psychologically, in every, it really feels like they want to hear that their story because they're the bad guys. But a lot of the times we need to kind of hear the bad guy story, even though we feel like it's there, it's in the media, it's being published in so many different places and stuff. But there are human experiences in those times as well. And it's just to kind of understand what really were going through the minds of the people that were put in these positions. I feel like that's always, and that really helps survivors as well, people that have lived under those scenarios or situations as well. So I think that's a really good healing place as well for many people. Yeah.
Interesting. Kavita?
I agree with Pat, actually. I think Forgotten Voices. But I also love things like the Listening Project, which Radio 4 does, which goes around the country, and it's like not big historical moments. It's just kind of big things in people's lives, but pass us all by every day. And I think it's the little stuff as well as like the really big stuff that is worth documenting, because it tells us a lot about our views on society at that particular moment in time as well. Yeah. So I would say yes, Forgotten Voices.
We've got lots of questions and very little time. So I will ask this one from Catherine. Isn't there a difference between collecting first-person testimony than collecting, say, family history, which is often people retelling stories of events that happened in generations past? Okay, yeah. So we're talking about first-person testimony versus recording people's reminiscences of other people, I guess.
Yeah, I'd say of course there's a difference, but as long as we express and let people know this, it is what it is. These are first-hand stories, and these are, and some of the oral history handed down, just because it's third and fourth, they are so important. And these are things that many of us in our cultures, we're losing. And when I say our cultures, I mean all of us, wherever we're from, we're losing those stories handed down.
Right. There's one about sort of safeguarding issues as stories unravel. I think we've covered that a little bit, haven't we? About just kind of, checking in with your interviewees that everything's okay. So I'm going to go on to this one. How will archives guarantee that the replay medium of current technology will exist along with the recordings as they do with tape recordings from far back as World War I? There could be millions. Who will choose what to keep? I think I can kind of answer that one a little bit. Yeah, it's not just the keeping the recordings, is it? It's keeping the technology going to replay those recordings. And something that the Unlocking Our Sound Heritage Project has been doing is digitizing lots of recordings so that they will be available for us to listen to in the future, and to be able to make new podcasts and radio programs and access that past forever. Thank you very much, everybody on the panel. I think we could probably talk for another hour, but I think we better stop now, because I'm sure other people have got things to do with their day as well. So thank you very much, everybody. And with that, I'll say goodbye and hopefully see you at a future event.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.